Chapter 4 Forest, Society and Colonialism. Take a quick look around your school and home and identify all the things that come from forests. The paper in the book you are reading, desks and tables, doors and windows, the dyes that color your clothes, spices in your food, the cellophane wrapper of your toffee, tendu leaves in beedis, gum, honey, coffee, tea and rubber. Do not miss out the oil in chocolates which comes from the sal seeds, the tannin used to convert skins and hides into leather, or the herbs and roots used for medicinal purposes. Forests also provide bamboo, wood for fuel, grass, charcoal, packaging, fruits, flowers, animals, birds, and many other things. In the Amazon forests or in the Western Ghats, it is possible to find as many as 500 different plant species in one forest patch. A lot of this diversity is fast disappearing. Between 1700 and 1995, the period of industrialization, 13.9 million square kilometers of forest or 9.3% of the world's total area was cleared for industrial use, cultivation, pastures and fuel wood. Why deforestation? The disappearance of forests is referred to as deforestation. Deforestation is not a recent problem. The process began many centuries ago, but under colonial rule, it became more systematic and extensive. Let us look at some of the causes of deforestation in India. Land to be improved. In 1600, approximately 1/6 of India's landmass was under cultivation. Now that figure has gone up to about half. As population increased over the centuries and the demand for food went up, peasants extended the boundaries of cultivation, clearing forests and breaking new land. In the colonial period, cultivation expanded rapidly for a variety of reasons. First, the British directly encouraged the production of commercial crops like jute, sugar, wheat and cotton. The demand for these crops increased in 19th century Europe, where food grains were needed to feed the growing urban population and raw materials were required for industrial production. Second, in the early 19th century, the colonial state thought that forests were unproductive. They were considered to be wilderness that had to be brought under cultivation so that the land could yield agricultural products and revenue and enhance the income of the state. So between 1880 and 1920, cultivated area rose by 6.7 million hectares. We always see the expansion of cultivation as a sign of progress, but we should not forget that for land to be brought under the plough, forests have to be cleared. Box 1. The absence of cultivation in a place does not mean the land was uninhabited. In Australia, when the white settlers landed, they claimed that the continent was empty or terra nullius. In fact, they were guided through the landscape by aboriginal tracks and led by aboriginal guides. The different aboriginal communities in Australia had clearly demarcated territories. The Garindejri people of Australia plotted their land along the symbolic body of the first ancestor, Gurunderi. This land included 5 different environments: salt water, riverine tracts, lakes, bush and desert plains, which satisfied different socio-economic needs. The idea that uncultivated land had to be taken over and improved was popular with colonizers everywhere in the world. It was an argument that justified conquest. In 1896, the American writer Richard Harding wrote on the Honduras in Central America. There is no more interesting question of the present day than that of what is to be done with the world's land which is lying unimproved, whether it shall go to the great power that is willing to turn it to account, or remain with its original owner who fails to understand its value. The Central Americans are like a gang of semi-barbarians in a beautifully furnished house, of which they can understand neither its possibilities of comfort nor its use. 3 years later, the American-owned United Fruit Company was founded and grew bananas on an industrial scale in Central America. The company acquired such power over the governments of these countries that they came to be known as banana republics. Sleepers on the tracks. By the early 19th century, oak forests in England were disappearing. This created a problem of timber supply for the Royal Navy. How could English ships be built without a regular supply of strong and durable timber? How could imperial power be protected and maintained without ships? By the 1820s, search parties were sent to explore the forest resources of India. Within a decade, trees were being felled on a massive scale and vast quantities of timber were being exported from India. The spread of railways from the 1850s created a new demand. Railways were essential for colonial trade and for the movement of imperial troops. To run locomotives, wood was needed as fuel, and to lay railway lines, sleepers were essential to hold the tracks together. Each mile of railway track required between 1,760 and 2,000 sleepers. From 1860s, the railway network expanded rapidly. By 1890, about 25,500 kilometers of track had been laid. In 1946, the length of the tracks had increased to over 7,65,000 kilometers. As the railway track spread through India, a larger and larger number of trees were felled. As early as the 1850s, in the Madras Presidency alone, 35,000 trees were being cut annually for sleepers. The government gave out contracts to individuals to supply the required quantities. These contractors began cutting trees indiscriminately. Forests around the railway tracks fast started disappearing. The new line to be constructed was the Indus Valley Railway between Multan and Sukkur, a distance of nearly 300 miles. At the rate of 2,000 sleepers per mile, this would require 6 lakh sleepers 10 feet by 10 inches by 5 inches or 3.5 cubic feet apiece, being upwards of 20 lakh cubic feet. The locomotives would use wood fuel at the rate of 1 train daily either way and at 1 mon per train mile. An annual supply of 2,19,000 mons would be demanded. In addition, a large supply of fuel for brick burning would be required. The sleepers would have to come mainly from the Sindh forests. The fuel from the Tamarisk and Jhand forests of Sindh and the Punjab. The other new lines was the Northern State Railway from Lahore to Multan. It was estimated that 22 lakh sleepers would be required for its construction. Plantations. Large areas of natural forests were also cleared to make way for tea, coffee, and rubber plantations to meet Europe's growing need for these commodities. The colonial government took over the forests and gave vast areas to European planters at cheap rates. These areas were enclosed and cleared of forests and planted with tea or coffee. The rise of commercial forestry. In the previous section, we have seen that the British needed forests in order to build ships and railways. The British were worried that the use of forests by the local people and the reckless felling of trees by traders would destroy forests. So they decided to invite a German expert, Dietrich Brandes, for advice and made him the first Inspector General of Forests in India. Brandes realized that a proper system had to be introduced to manage the forests and people had to be trained in the science of conservation. This system would need legal sanction. Rules about the use of forest resources had to be framed. Felling of trees and grazing had to be restricted so that forests could be preserved for timber production. Anybody who cut trees without following the system had to be punished. So, Brandes set up the Indian Forest Service in 1864 and helped formulate the Indian Forest Act of 1865. The Imperial Forest Research Institute was set up at Dehradun in 1906. The system they taught here was called scientific forestry. Many people now, including ecologists, feel that this system is not scientific at all. In scientific forestry, natural forests which had lots of different types of trees were cut down. In their place, one type of tree was planted in straight rows. This is called a plantation. Forest officials surveyed the forests, estimated the area under different types of trees, and made working plans for forest management. They planned how much of the plantation area to cut every year. The area cut was then to be replanted so that it was ready to be cut again in some years. After the Forest Act was enacted in 1865, it was amended twice, once in 1878 and then in 1927. The 1878 Act divided forests into three categories: reserved, protected, and village forests. The best forests were called reserved forests. Villagers could not take anything from these forests, even for their own use. For house building or fuel, they could take wood from protected or village forests. How were the lives of people affected? Foresters and villagers had very different ideas of what a good forest should look like. Villagers wanted forests with a mixture of species to satisfy different needs: fuel, fodder, leaves. The forest department, on the other hand, wanted trees which were suitable for building ships or railways. They needed trees that could provide hardwood and were tall and straight. So particular species like teak and sal were promoted and others were cut. In forest areas, people use forest products, roots, leaves, fruits and tubers for many things. Fruits and tubers are nutritious to eat, especially during the monsoons before the harvest has come in. Herbs are used for medicine. Wood for agricultural implements like yokes and plows. Bamboo makes excellent fences and is also used to make baskets and umbrellas. A dried, scooped out gourd can be used as a portable water bottle. Almost everything is available in the forest. Leaves can be stitched together to make disposable plates and cups. The siadi creeper can be used to make ropes, and the thorny bark of the semur, silk cotton tree, is used to grate vegetables. Oil for cooking and to light lamps can be pressed from the fruit of the mahua tree. Collecting mahua. Villagers wake up before dawn and go to the forest to collect the mahua flowers which have fallen on the forest floor. Mahua trees are precious. Mahua flowers can be eaten or used to make alcohol. The seeds can be used to make oil. Drying tendu leaves. The sale of tendu leaves is a major source of income for many people living in forests. Each bundle contains approximately 50 leaves, and if a person works very hard, they can perhaps collect as many as 100 bundles in a day. Women, children, and old men are the main collectors. The Forest Act meant severe hardships for villagers across the country. After the act, all their everyday practices, cutting wood for their houses, grazing their cattle, collecting fruits and roots, hunting and fishing became illegal. People were now forced to steal wood from the forests, and if they were caught, they were at the mercy of the forest guards who would take bribes from them. Women who collected fuel wood were especially worried. It was also common for the police, constables, and forest guards to harass people by demanding free food from them. How did forest rules affect cultivation? One of the major impacts of European colonialism was on the practice of shifting cultivation or swidden agriculture. This is a traditional agricultural practice in many parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. It has many local names such as lading in Southeast Asia, milpa in Central America, chitmene or tavi in Africa, and chena in Sri Lanka. In India, dhya, penda, bevar, nevad, jhum, podu, khandad, and kumri are some of the local terms for swidden agriculture. In shifting cultivation, parts of the forests are cut and burnt in rotation. Seeds are sown in the ashes after the first monsoon rains, and the crop is harvested by October-November. Such plots are cultivated for a couple of years and then left fallow for 12 to 18 years for the forest to grow back. A mixture of crops is grown on these plots. In central India and Africa, it could be millets. In Brazil, manioc, and in other parts of Latin America, maize and beans. European foresters regarded this practice as harmful for the forests. They felt that land which was used for cultivation every few years could not grow trees for railway timber. When a forest was burnt, there was the added danger of the flames spreading and burning valuable timber. Taungya cultivation was a system in which local farmers were allowed to cultivate temporarily within a plantation. In this photo taken in Tharavadi division in Burma in 1921, the cultivators are sowing paddy. The men make holes in the soil using long bamboo poles with iron tips. The women sow paddy in each hole. Burning the forest penda or podu plot. In shifting cultivation, a clearing is made in the forest, usually on the slopes of hills. After the trees have been cut, they are burnt to provide ashes. The seeds are then scattered in the area and left to be irrigated by the rain. Shifting cultivation also made it harder for the government to calculate taxes. Therefore, the government decided to ban shifting cultivation. As a result, many communities were forcibly displaced from their homes in the forests. Some had to change occupations, while some resisted through large and small rebellions. Who could hunt? The new forest laws changed the lives of forest dwellers in yet another way. Before the forest laws, many people who lived in or near forests had survived by hunting deer, partridges, and a variety of small animals. This customary practice was prohibited by the forest laws. Those who were caught hunting were now punished for poaching. While the forest laws deprived people of their customary rights to hunt, hunting of big game became a sport. In India, hunting of tigers and other animals had been part of the culture of the court and nobility for centuries. Many Mughal paintings show princes and emperors enjoying a hunt. But under colonial rule, the scale of hunting increased to such an extent that various species became almost extinct. The British saw large animals as signs of a wild, primitive, and savage society. They believed that by killing dangerous animals, the British would civilize India. They gave rewards for the killing of tigers, wolves, and other large animals on the grounds that they posed a threat to cultivators. Over 80,000 tigers, 150,000 leopards, and 2 lakh wolves were killed for reward in the period 1875 to 1925. Gradually, the tiger came to be seen as a sporting trophy. The Maharaja of Sarguja alone shot 1,157 tigers and 2,000 leopards up to 1957. A British administrator, George Yule, killed 400 tigers. Initially, certain areas of forests were reserved for hunting. Only much later did environmentalists and conservators begin to argue that all these species of animals needed to be protected and not killed. Lord Reading hunting in Nepal. Count the dead tigers in the photo. When British colonial officials and Rajas went hunting, they were accompanied by a whole retinue of servants. Usually, the tracking was done by skilled village hunters, and the Sahib simply fired the shot. Baigas were a forest community of central India. In 1892, after their shifting cultivation was stopped, they petitioned to the government. We daily starve, having had no food grain in our possession. The only wealth we possess is our axe. We have no clothes to cover our body with, but we pass cold nights by the fireside. We are now dying for want of food. We cannot go elsewhere. What fault have we done that the government does not take care of us? Prisoners are supplied with ample food in jail. A cultivator of the grass is not deprived of his holding, but the government does not give us our right who have lived here for generations past. New trade created new employments and new services. While people lost out in many ways after the forest department took control of the forests, some people benefited from the new opportunities that had opened up in trade. Many communities left their traditional occupations and started trading in forest products. This happened not only in India but across the world. For example, with the growing demand for rubber in the mid-19th century, the Munduruku peoples of the Brazilian Amazon, who lived in villages on high ground and cultivated manioc, began to collect latex from the wild rubber trees for supplying to traders. Gradually, they descended to live in trading posts and became completely dependent on traders. In India, the trade in forest products was not new. From the medieval period onwards, we have records of Adivasi communities trading elephants and other goods like hides, horns, silk cocoons, ivory, bamboo, spices, fibers, grasses, gums, and raisins through nomadic communities like the Banjaras. With the coming of the British, however, trade was completely regulated by the government. The British government gave many large European trading firms the sole right to trade in the forest products of particular areas. Grazing and hunting by local people were restricted. In the process, many pastoralist and nomadic communities like the Korava, Karacha, and Yerukula of the Madras Presidency lost their livelihoods. Some of them began to be called criminal tribes and were forced to work instead in factories, mines, and plantations under government supervision. New opportunities of work did not always mean improved well-being for the people. In Assam, both men and women from forest communities like Santals and Oraons from Jharkhand and Gonds from Chhattisgarh were recruited to work on tea plantations. Their wages were low and conditions of work were very bad. They could not return easily to their home villages from where they had been recruited. Rubber extraction in the Putumayo. Everywhere in the world, conditions of work in plantations were horrific. The extraction of rubber in the Putumayo region of the Amazon by the Peruvian Rubber Company with British and Peruvian interests was dependent on the forced labor of the local Indians called Huitotos. From 1900 to 1912, the Putumayo output of 4,000 tons of rubber was associated with a decrease of some 30,000 among the Indian population due to torture, disease, and flight. A letter by an employee of a rubber company describes how the rubber was collected. The manager summoned hundreds of Indians to the station. He grasped his carbine and machete and began the slaughter of these defenseless Indians, leaving the ground covered with 150 corpses, among them men, women, and children. Bathed in blood and appealing for mercy, the survivors were heaped with the dead and burned to death, while the manager shouted, "I want to exterminate all the Indians who do not obey my orders about the rubber that I require them to bring in." Rebellion in the forest. In many parts of India and across the world, forest communities rebelled against the changes that were being imposed on them. The leaders of these movements against the British, like Sidhu and Kanu in the Santhal Parganas, Birsa Munda of Chota Nagpur, or Alluri Sitaram Raju of Andhra Pradesh, are still remembered today in songs and stories. We will now discuss in detail one such rebellion which took place in the kingdom of Bastar in 1910. The people of Bastar. Bastar is located in the southernmost part of Chhattisgarh and borders Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, and Maharashtra. The central part of Bastar is on a plateau. To the north of this plateau is the Chhattisgarh plain, and to its south is the Godavari plain. The river Indravati winds across Bastar east to west. A number of different communities live in Bastar, such as Maria and Muria Gonds, Dhurvas, Bhatras, and Halbas. They speak different languages but share common customs and beliefs. the people of Bastar believed that each village was given its land by the earth, and in return they look after the earth by making some offerings at each agricultural festival. In addition to the earth, they show respect to the spirits of the river, the forest, and the mountain. Since each village knows where its boundaries lie, the local people look after all the natural resources within that boundary. If people from a village want to take some wood from the forests of another village, they pay a small fee called Devsari, Dand, or Maan in exchange. Some villages also protect their forests by engaging watchmen, and each household contributes some grain to pay them. Every year there is one big hunt where the headmen of villages in a pargana cluster of villages meet and discuss issues of concern including forests. The fears of the people. When the colonial government proposed to reserve two-thirds of the forest in 1905 and stop shifting cultivation, hunting and collection of the forest produce, the people of Bastar were very worried. Some villages were allowed to stay on in the reserved forests on the condition that they worked free for the forest department in cutting and transporting trees and protecting the forests from fires. Subsequently, these came to be known as forest villages. People of other villages were displaced without any notice or compensation. For long, villagers had been suffering from increased land rents and frequent demands for free labor and goods by colonial officials. Then came the terrible famines in 1899, 1900, and again in 1907, 1908. Reservations proved to be the last straw. People began to gather and discuss these issues in their village councils, in bazaars, and at festivals, or wherever the headmen and priests of several villages were assembled. The initiative was taken by the Dhurvas of the Kanger forest, where reservation first took place. Although there was no single leader, many people speak of Gunda Dhur from village Nethanar as an important figure in the movement. In 1910, mango bows, a lump of earth, chilies and arrows began circulating between villages. These were actually messages inviting villagers to rebel against the British. Every village contributed something to the rebellion expenses. Bazaars were looted, the houses of officials and traders, schools and police stations were burnt and robbed, and grain redistributed. Most of those who were attacked were in some way associated with the colonial state and its oppressive laws. William Ward, a missionary who observed the events, wrote, "From all directions came streaming into Jagdalpur police, merchants, forest peons, schoolmasters, and immigrants." Bhondia collected 400 men, sacrificed a number of goats, and started off to intercept the Diwan, who was expected to return from the direction of Bijapur. This mob started on the 10th February, burned the Marenga school, the police post, lines and pound at Kaslur, and the school at Tokapal, Rajpur. Detached a contingent to burn Karanji school and captured a head constable and 4 constables of the State Reserve Police who had been sent out to escort the Diwan and bring him in. The mob did not maltreat the guards seriously but eased them of their weapons and let them go. One party of rebels under Bhondia Majhi went off to the Koyer river to block the passage there in case the Diwan left the main road. The rest went on to Dilmilli to stop the main road from Bijapur. Buddhu Maji and Harchand Nayak led the main body. Elders living in Bastar recounted the story of this battle they had heard from their parents. Podiyami Ganga of Kankapal was told by his father Podiyami Tokeli that the British came and started taking land. The Raja didn't pay attention to things happening around him. So seeing that land was being taken, his supporters gathered people. War started. His staunch supporters died and the rest were whipped. My father Podiyami Tokeli suffered many strokes, but he escaped and survived. It was a movement to get rid of the British. The British used to tie them to horses and pull them. From every village, 2 or 3 people went to Jagdalpur. Gargi Deva and Michukola of Chidpal, Dole and Adrabundi of Markamiras, Vadapandu of Belaras, Unga of Palem, and many others. Similarly, Chendru, an elder from village Nandrasa, said, on the people's side were the big elders, Mili Muddal of Palem, Soekal Dhurva of Nandrasa, and Pandwa Maji. People from every Pargana camped in Alanar Tarai. The Paltan force surrounded the people in a flash. Gundadhur had flying powers and flew away. But what could those with bows and arrows do? The battle took place at night. The people hid in shrubs and crawled away. The army, Paltan, also ran away. All those who remained alive of the people somehow found their way home to their villages. The British sent troops to suppress the rebellion. The Adivasi leaders tried to negotiate, but the British surrounded their camps and fired upon them. After that, they marched through the villages, flogging and punishing those who had taken part in the rebellion. Most villages were deserted as people fled into the jungles. It took 3 months, February to May, for the British to regain control. However, they never managed to capture Gundadhur. In a major victory for the rebels, work on reservation was temporarily suspended and the area to be reserved was reduced to roughly half of that planned before 1910. The story of the forests and people of Bastar does not end there. After independence, the same practice of keeping people out of the forests and reserving them for industrial use continued. In the 1970s, the World Bank proposed that 4,600 hectares of natural sal forest should be replaced by tropical pine to provide pulp for the paper industry. It was only after protests by local environmentalists that the project was stopped. Let us now go to another part of Asia, Indonesia, and see what was happening there over the same period. Forest transformations in Java. Java is now famous as a rice-producing island of Indonesia, but once upon a time it was covered mostly with forests. The colonial power in Indonesia were the Dutch, and as we will see, there were many similarities in the laws for forest control in Indonesia and India. Java in Indonesia is where the Dutch started forest management. Like the British, they wanted timber from Java to build ships. In 1600, the population of Java was an estimated 3.4 million. There were many villages in the fertile plains, but there were also many communities living in the mountains and practicing shifting cultivation. The woodcutters of Java. The Kalangs of Java were a community of skilled forest cutters and shifting cultivators. They were so valuable that in 1755, when the Mataram kingdom of Java split, The 6,000 Kalang families were equally divided between the two kingdoms. Without their expertise, it would have been difficult to harvest teak and for the kings to build their palaces.